Welcome to today's session of the Populism Seminar, which is a joint initiative by Annika Werner, Andreas Haslove, Maurits Meyers, and myself, Robert Huber. And today we have a lovely session on new perspectives on populist success with Noam Gidron from the Hebrew University and Elena Baro from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Before handing over to Noam, let me just say a couple of things associated with the organization of the seminar. So first of all, given that Christmas is soon and this end of semester is soon as well, we will have an open call for the next year, so for spring 2022. And similar to the last time, we will open a call via our homepage later this week. And we invite you all to submit interesting papers and presentations, because at the end of the day, the success of the Populism Seminar is really the high quality presentations that we have. We're really excited to hear about your research. So please stay tuned on our Twitter account, on the website to see when the call is finally on our website. But we wanted to give you a heads up already. Second, as always, I want to briefly give you the house rules for today's session. So as always, we record the session. You will find it on YouTube afterwards as well. And after the presentations, which are around 10-ish minutes, we will have a Q&A or a discussion. And please either use the Q&A function or raise your hand, and we can give you the permission to open your mic and pose the question yourself. So without much further ado, I'm extremely excited for today's presentation. So Noam, let me hand over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Robert. And let me share the screen with you. Okay. So I hope that now you can see my screen okay? Perfect. Well, thank you to the organizers and for everyone here. It's nice to see familiar faces and familiar names in the audience. It's a great pleasure to present our work here. And today I will be presenting work that is part of a larger project I've been working with together with Oren Danieli and Roy Levy from Tel Aviv University and Shin Kikuchi from MIT. Now, this is the first time for us to present something out of this project, so we are very excited and we thank you for your comments and feedback, and I want to encourage you to be in touch later on if you have any further thoughts or ideas about how we can further develop this work. So the title of our paper is Decomposing the Rise of the Populist Right. Now, everyone here, for this audience, there's no need to make the case that we've seen the rise of support for populist radical right parties, specifically across Europe, and this is one of the more important political developments of recent years. Now, we've seen growing support for populist radical right parties. We've also seen a growing body of literature trying to first identify this phenomenon of the populist radical right, then thinking about how the rise of this party affects a host of outcomes of interest, such as policymaking and government composition, and also a lot of research that seeks to identify drivers of support for populist radical right parties, thinking about why these parties have gained so much support in the last 2 or 3 decades. Now, in our reading of the literature, we currently don't really lack explanations for the rise of the populist right. So our goal in this paper is not to make the case for one more additional factor that may explain why certain people are likely to vote for the radical right. This is not the focus of the paper. Instead, what we aim to do here is to first identify different categories of explanation, sets of explanations, and then assess the relative explanatory power and how they can help us understand the rise of the populist right within the time frame of the last 20 years in Europe. So let me make this much more concrete. We identify three sets of explanations for why radical right parties have gained power in the last 2 or 3 decades. The first set of explanation deals with voters' characteristics, both voters' demographics and their attitudes. So it may be that the electorate has changed over the last 3 decades in ways that are advantageous for populist radical right parties. For instance, we have research about the implications of trade shocks and how people who live in regions that have been affected by trade shocks may become more authoritarian. Their attitude may change. They become more opposed to globalization. And this may nudge them toward populist radical right parties. So we have one set of explanation that focuses on voters, on changes in the electorate. Then we have a second set of explanation that point not to the masses, but rather to political elites, shifting the perspective from voters' characteristics to parties' characteristics. So it may be that not only voters have changed, but also the electoral supply has changed. In some cases, the supply may change following the entrance of new populist radical right parties into the electoral arena. Simply put, we know that now we have more populist radical right parties competing than in the 1980s, for instance. Then it may also be that populist right parties have changed their positions in a way that led to their growing support. They may have become more extreme on some of the issues, and they may become more moderate in some other positions. So we have the second set of explanation that focuses on changes in parties' characteristics. Lastly, we want to propose a third set of explanation. It may be that voters and parties mostly remained the same, and what has changed is the importance of certain issues, the weight attached to certain issues in the electoral arena. And we think about this as a change in weights, as I said. The weights people attach to certain issues when they decide who they're going to vote for. So even if attitudes haven't changed and if parties haven't changed significantly, it may be that over time people think about certain issues as more important, and that's what now determines their vote choice. And this is our key point. It is mostly changes in weights, the weights voters attach to issues, that help explain the rise of the populist radical right in Europe in the last 2 decades. So if there's like one thing that you're going to take from the presentation, I hope it's this one, that it's mostly this change of weights that help explain the rise of the populist right. We see almost no change or no implications of change in voter characteristics for support for the radical right. So it's not that the electorate has moved toward these parties, and this is what's driving their ascendance. We find no evidence for that. We do find some evidence that changes in party supply or party characteristics help explain the rise of the populist right, especially in the early 2000s, and I'll say about it some more in a minute. Now, of course, we are not the first to suggest that changes in the importance of issues, changes in weights, is what best explains the rise of populist radical right parties, although I do think that we are the first to examine this issue systematically and comprehensively. So Larry Bartels, in a very elegant way, suggested that we should think about the rise of populist right parties not as a result of major shifts in public opinion. Instead, we should think about a reservoir of attitudes, worldviews, sentiments that successful populist radical right parties can tap into. And our results are very much in line with this argument. Attitudes haven't changed drastically, and when they changed, they didn't necessarily change in the direction of the populist radical right, but rather it is weights that change more significantly. Okay, but how did we reach this conclusion? So we analyzed data from across Europe, both East and West, and our dataset covers 20 countries for a time period of almost 20 years. We are now working on expanding the universe of cases to include few more countries. And we classify which parties should be considered as populist based on the Populist dataset that I know some of you are very closely familiar with. So we need 3 types of inputs, or 3 types of data sources about each of our factors in order to assess the 3 sets of categories next to one another. In order to capture voters' characteristics, we rely on the integrated values survey, the combination of the World Value Survey and European Value Surveys. For parties' positions, we rely on the Comparative Manifesto Project, which provides us information about how parties position themselves on multiple issues. Now, issue weights, the importance of issues, this is the hardest factor to capture since we do not observe it directly from the data. So here we rely on a probabilistic econometric model that assesses for each observation, for each respondent in our dataset, how much weight they attach to each issue on which parties campaign. And we are happy to elaborate about this later on. So just to give you a broad overview of the data, we begin with more than 100,000 observations. So that's quite a lot, quite a big data set. Then we narrow it down. And when we look only at respondents for which we have data, we know who they vote for, and we have Comparative Manifesto data for these parties, that leaves us with close to 70,000 observations and more than 7,500 supporters of populist radical right parties. So still a very nice data set. The empirical strategy here relies on decomposition models that we adopt from work in labor economics. Economists use decomposition methods to assess how much different developments contribute to an outcome of interest. For instance, if we want to understand the increase in economic inequality, we can see how much different developments contribute to rising economic inequality. For instance, trade shocks or the decline of unions or automation. And here we want to do a similar exercise. We want to see how much each of the three developments that I outlined before, changes in voters' characteristics, changes in parties' characteristics, and changes in weights, how much each of these developments can help us understand the rise of populist right parties. So we can think about it as how much support for populist right parties would change between two time periods if we hold two of the factors constant and only allow one of the factors to change. And here's what we get from this methodological exercise. First, let's look at the overall changes in support for populist radical right parties. So the change between 1990 and 2020, that's our 100%, right? That's the 100% change we're interested in explaining. And we can see that 25% of this change took place in the first decade covered in our data, between 1999 and 2009. Then another 25%, bringing us to 50%, took place until 2014. And the rest of the 50% of the increase in support for populist right parties take place since 2014. So that gives us a broad overview of the timing of the overall increase in support for populist radical right parties. But what we are interested in is to decompose these developments and see how much of them is driven by changes in voters' characteristics, parties' characteristics, and the weights. And this is the results we get. These are our main results when we disaggregate the increase in support for populist right parties into these three different factors. And what we can see is that in the first time period, that is until 2009, what is driving support for the populist radical right is mostly changes in party supply. That would be the pink or pinkish bar that you see there. Now, we are still working on more closely examining whether the change in party supply that matters the most here is party entrance, populist radical right parties entering the electoral arena, or changes in these parties' positions, or both. But it seems like party entrance play a major role within this time period of before 2009, maybe less so afterwards. Interestingly, in the second time period, it is mostly changes in weight, the importance of different issues, that is by far the most consequential driver of support for populist radical right parties. And changes in weights explain more than 70% of the increase in voting for populist radical right parties since 2009, with the other 30% mostly explained by changes in parties' characteristics. So when we look more closely here, and these would be, I think, that like kind of between blue and purple, here we can see the increase in weights and how they can explain to us the growing support for populist radical right parties. Now, perhaps surprisingly, we find no evidence that changes in voters' characteristics, either their demographics or maybe more importantly, their attitudes, can explain the rising support of the populist for the populist radical right. If anything, public opinion or voters' characteristics seem to push in the other direction. So put differently, if we hold constant both parties' characteristics and the weights, and just allow movements in voters' characteristics within this time period, we probably would not have seen this increase in support for radical right parties. And we think this is highly consequential because maybe it challenges, in a way, a common narrative in both among scholars and in the media, according to which economic developments such as exposure to international trade or cultural threats following exposure to refugees have pushed public opinion toward populist radical right parties. We simply find no evidence for that. Instead, in the first time period, it's mostly changes in parties' characteristics, and even more so in the second time period, it's mostly change in the weights attached to issues. Now we have some more evidence for this lack of changes in public opinion, and because we wanted to make sure this is not just an artifact of the model, we looked more closely at changes in voters' attitudes on the core ideological issues of populist right parties, issues related to nativism and authoritarianism, and we find no significant changes in public opinion in the direction of populist radical right parties. If anything, it seems that voters have moved further away from the positions associated with populist radical right parties on these type of issues that relates to national identity and LGBT rights or the family structure. So we feel rather confident in saying that it's probably not changes in voter attitudes, and the answer lies somewhere else. Okay, so let me quickly wrap up. So our analysis and the decomposition exercise all boil down to one key point, that in Europe over the last 20 years, the change that has pushed voters toward populist radical right parties is first and foremost a change in the importance, a change in the weights attached to the issues populist radical right parties emphasize in their campaigns. Now, of course, we didn't provide an explanation for why we've seen a change in weights, right? And we see this as a crucial path for future research on populism in general and right-wing populism in particular. And here we are following the footsteps of Bart Bonikovsky, who presented in the seminar just a few weeks ago, who urged scholars to pay closer attention to this question of why certain issues become more resonant or more important, carry more weight at certain moments in time rather than others. Now, there are several extensions of our work on which we're currently thinking about. First, we want to look more closely at cross-national variations in the decomposition findings. Maybe it is the case that in some countries or even in some regions, we do see a change in attitudes, or that change in weights is driven by specific countries. Actually, we haven't found much evidence to suggest so at the moment, but we are still looking at this more closely. Now, the framework we developed here that distinguishes between parties, voters, and weights, of course, could be used also for the study of not just of populist radical right parties, but also the challenges of center-left and center-right parties, or the rise of green parties. And there's nothing in this framework that limits us to study only European countries. And we are thinking about whether we can use it also to explore the rise of populist right parties, leaders, and causes in other parts of the globe. But this is where we currently stand. As I said, this is work in progress and the first time that we are presenting findings from this project. So we are very much looking forward to your comments and feedback. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Noam, for presenting your very, very new work. That's always very exciting. And just a quick reminder to the audience that you can already put your questions into the Q&A box if you want to, or of course you can then raise your hand. But before we get into the discussion, I'll hand over to Elena and her presentation.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
At the moment, we see the main slide and lots of other smaller slides. So it's in a in a slightly different mode.
Yeah.
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. So first and foremost, thanks for organizing this very interesting seminar and for giving me the opportunity to present. Today I will present a paper that I wrote together with Professor Anders Todden Jensen, and it's titled "The Cultural Backlash Theory in a European Context." So this paper builds on the cultural backlash theory as developed by Norris and Engelhardt. And this theory holds that authoritarian populism in America and in Europe is caused by a cultural backlash, so a conservative and religious mobilization in favor of traditional and Christian values, and by an authoritarian reflex. And this authoritarian reflex is caused by economic vulnerability, insecurity, and relative deprivation, and by the presence of ethnic minorities or outgroups. And here we see a scheme summarizing the theory. So we have on one side the value change that reaches a tipping point, so more liberal and self-expression values, which leads to the political mobilization of conservative forces. And parallelly, we have the economic deprivation and insecurity and the presence of immigrants, which leads to the authoritarian reflex. And together they explain the support for authoritarian populism. However, we identify some criticalities in this theory, and especially we see that in Europe, the parties that Norris and Engelhardt describe as authoritarian populists are very diverse, and therefore the cultural shift from conservative to more progressive values might be at different stages in these different European countries. Also, European countries have different experiences with immigration, economic vulnerability, authoritarian and democratic heritages, religiosity, and value change. So building on this, we tried with this study to refine the cultural backlash argument by retesting it in 4 countries, namely Hungary, Italy, Norway, and Poland. And to analyze if and how the different contexts of these countries highlight the different aspects of the cultural backlash, and if all the explanatory factors which they use in the backlash model are necessary to explain the support for authoritarian populist parties. And we also disentangle the effects of authoritarianism and social conservatism, as Norris and Engelhardt included items tapping into social conservatism to measure authoritarianism. To do so, we used the European values study data for the year 2017, and we used for dependent variable the preference for authoritarian populist parties, and we kept the definition provided by Norris and Engelhardt. And then we have the group of cultural backlash variables, which is anti-immigrants attitudes, authoritarianism, nationalism, social conservatism, and religiosity. To tap into the economic deprivation, we ask for the experience of unemployment, social benefits, and income. And we controlled for education, age, and gender. And we carried out the analysis with the logistic regressions. I will now provide a summary of the contextual differences of the 4 analyzed countries. So to start with, religion and social conservatism, we have 4 quite different situations. We have Poland, in which the church is a very strong political actor and its position is not threatened from the inside. And then on the opposite, we have Norway, and we know that Norwegians are among the least religious people in Europe. In Hungary, Fidesz emphasize Christian values. However, on a more concrete level, they show a more relaxed commitment, let's say, in comparison with the Polish example. While in Italy, we have been seeing a decline in religiosity, and recent struggles between conservatives and progressive forces on a law criminalizing hate speech against LGBTQ. Then regarding authoritarian and democratic heritages, we have also very different experiences across these countries. We have Hungary and Poland, which have an overall limited experience with democracy due to the experience of communism. And then at the opposite side, we have Norway, which has 2 centuries long unbroken democratic tradition. And then Italy is somewhat in the middle. In addition to the experience of fascism, Italy had a bumpy process of democratization, as the post-war period was marked by political tension and instability and violence. We also have a different diffusion of nationalistic sentiment. We have the more extreme case of Hungary. Hungary has historical conflicts on the mismatch between the location of Hungarians and the country's borders, while we have less of this in Norway, Poland, and Italy, which especially Norway and Poland are rather ethnically homogeneous states. And then again, the analyzed countries have different experiences with economic hardship. In Hungary, Fidesz won after years of austerity and mismanaging of the economy by the Sociodemocratic Party. And on the presence of immigrants, Hungary, as Poland, experienced more emigration than immigration. In Poland, however, the difference is that the Law and Justice Party was elected after years of economic growth above the EU average and decrease in income inequality. And then we have Norway, the case of Norway, in which we have among the lowest level of income inequality, and the negative attitudes toward immigrants have been pretty stable, irrespective of the economy. And then Italy is again somewhat in the middle. We saw an increase in income inequality, and Italy has also a rougher experience of immigration, as it constitutes a stepping stone country for immigrants. I will now quickly summarize the results, and I also have some post-estimation graphs if we want to go more in detail after doing the discussion. As we can see here, the main common drivers for supporting authoritarian populists across countries are represented by authoritarianism and anti-immigrants attitudes. These two represent positive and significant predictors across the countries, even though we have some differences in effect, especially on authoritarianism in Norway. The same cannot be said about nationalism. Nationalism is significant and positive only in Hungary and Norway, even though, again, the effect is pretty marginal in Norway in comparison to the effect registered in Hungary, while this variable had non-significant effect in Poland and Italy. And surprisingly, social conservatism, which is at the core of the cultural backlash theory, is not significant in Hungary, and it's even negative in Italy and Norway, while it is positive and significant only in Poland. And finally, religiosity is positive. It's a positive predictor in Poland and Italy, while it is not significant in Hungary and Norway. So building on this, we have the following implication. We do not see signs of an ongoing cultural backlash in Hungary, as the most important predictors, as in the cultural backlash theory, did point at non-significant effect. Italy might be possibly on the tipping point, considering the contextual information as provided before, and also by this contradictory negative relationship of social conservatism and positive effect of religiosity. Norway seems to be beyond the tipping point. And in Poland, while religiosity and social conservatism do have a positive and significant effect, we must ask ourselves whether Poland actually reached the tipping point mentioned by Norris and Engelhardt, or whether these conservative views are still prevailing in society. So this study overall highlighted that there are different social forces and underlying dynamics determining the support for authoritarian populism and provided a more nuanced paradigm of far-right supporters. And it also highlights how the support for authoritarian populism has different matrices, which are not limited to a conflict between conservative and liberal values. Beyond the differences, we saw that the common denominators are anti-immigrants' attitudes and authoritarianism, the common denominators to support authoritarian populist parties. And we also saw that the support for social conservatism is not universal, and this lifts the question whether some of these parties use these values more as an identity marker than supporting these values per se. And then we did not find correspondence in this study for the argument that sees authoritarian populism to be rooted in personal economic deprivation. And here there are the graphs with the post-estimation based on the regression. If we want to go back to this maybe later during the discussion. So yeah, this was my presentation, and I look forward to questions, comments, feedback.
Thank you so much, Elena. Wonderful. Thanks again for to both Noam and Elena for your fantastic presentations and really interesting new research. Now we already have a few questions, and unsurprisingly, right now they're mainly to Noam, who's done the first presentation. So everybody gets a few minutes to type your questions to Elena into the Q&A. And we'll start out with Luca. Luca was the first one to raise his hand, and I'm going to I've unmuted you. Wonderful.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, great. I have two questions. Thanks to both of you. Noam, my first question goes to you, and I'm fascinated by how you empirically decompose the three explanation sets. And now I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more on the theoretical decomposition, so to say. I don't really get how a change in attitude weights can be theoretically be distinguished from changes in the electorate. So could you say a bit more about how you think about changes in attitude weights? I understand you that like a certain attitude becomes more important, but how is that related to the electorate changing or not changing at the same time? And then the second question goes to both of you, perhaps, namely how you think about how these two presentations go together. So Noam, as far as I understand, you showed that attitudes didn't change in the direction of the radical right, supporting your theory. But then Norris and Engelhardt have argued for a values change, right? And then this backlash, what's just been presented, right? So is that the difference in attitudes versus values? Does that explain the difference, or what is the difference between attitudes and values? How do you think about that? And that goes perhaps to both of you. Thank you.
Should I go first?
Since it's for both of you, yes. Why don't we? And it was two questions. Why don't we take those, and then we'll try and sum up some of the questions in the Q&A.
Okay. Sorry for jumping in with too much enthusiasm, but Luca, thanks for your question. And first, we want to be modest here. We do not develop a completely novel theoretical framework. What we do is to take arguments in the literature, try to organize them in a certain way, and then assess the relative explanatory power of these existing theories before this trend of increased support for the radical right. Now, theoretically, we can distinguish between attitudes and weights. People could have the same attitude, but one person would attach much greater weight for a certain issue, and that would be the issue based on which this person votes. And another person with the exact same set of attitudes may put more emphasis on a completely other set of issues. So we can distinguish analytically between attitudes and the weights attached to each attitude. Now, it's something of a semantic question whether we want to define this category of weights as part of the voters' characteristics or something different, right? We can say, well, we have maybe two sets of explanations about voters, one about attitudes and the other about weights. And currently, I think we are still not sure ourselves how to best organize it. In a way, it's more, I think, a semantic issue than purely analytic or theoretical. But I think it's important to make the case that people with the same attitudes can put different emphasis, different weights on different issues. The question is, indeed, how exactly we define that. Now, to be completely open, we refer to this as weights. Other people, I think, have a very similar thing in mind when they speak about salience, right? And yet others, including my friend and co-author, Bart Bonikovsky, refer to this as resonance. So I feel like there are different labels that are all referring to very similar theoretical concepts. So we are now referring to this as weights, but we are very open to rethinking this categorization or this terminology, and happy to continue the conversation later on about how we can improve on what we have.
Yeah, I guess this last sentence also summarized what my take is on how these two presentations go together. I guess is not to look for new overarching explanation of why we have this increase in support for radical right, but rather work with what we have and try to provide more defined explanations, to try to look more into the details. So I guess we're not trying to look only for differences to discard these theories, but simply try to look more into the details of what we already have. And as I said, yes, Norris and Engelhardt did argue that this change in attitude generated this cultural backlash that then led to the support for authoritarian populist parties. But also, like how we just saw in the presentation, there seems not to be so much support for that, at least not across cases. It might be that in the pooled dataset, the results are different. However, if we look into the individual cases, we see more differences than actually commonalities. So I guess that this is probably the guiding line here, to try and work with what we have and try to improve with what we have instead of looking for new theories.
Thank you both. And I mean, Noam, I think you already sort of mentioned or answered one of the questions that we have in the Q&A about the difference between weights and saliency. So I'm not going to jump into that one. But there's actually two people, Noam, for you, who both Paul Lentwy and Luana Russo asked which issues are actually the ones that drive that kind of that weight argument. Is it more the economic issues or more the cultural issues? And then Brett Meyer also asked whether how you actually disentangle this issue weights with the party entry part. And Brett, he says, I would think that the later would cause the former, so the issue weights might cause the party entry, and whether maybe with some lag, and how you deal with that. And then we'll just, I'll just take a few together for Elena. Michal here asked specifically about Poland, and especially that in Poland in the last 2 years, the church has suddenly weakened. And he asked what you make out of this, and how will this, whether this changes the backlash, whether that, what that does to the whole backlash argument. Noam, maybe you start.
Perfect. So maybe I'll keep Brad's question to the end, because it's really hard one, and maybe by then I'll run out of time. But can I share my screen for a second again? So here you can see which issues changed weights. And we can see that, so here on the x-axis, we have the importance people attach to different issues. And we can see that for the society index here is actually cultural issues as defined by the CMP dataset. So we didn't want to take the liberty to decide ourselves, but the CMP suggests a way to construct an index of partisan positions on mostly cultural issues, and these would be issues of national identity, cosmopolitanism, peace, family structure, traditional morality, all of these. And we can see the change of weights slowly shifting right-wing, which meaning that people with more culturally conservative attitudes now put more weight on these issues. So we have already evidence from analysis of CMP data that parties are putting more weight or giving a more salient place to their positions on cultural issues. Here we see that this is reflected in how people vote, and that people attach greater importance to cultural issues, and specifically that people with culturally conservative attitudes, they are the one attaching more importance to these issues, such as traditional morality and national identity. So we definitely are now in the process of disaggregating this change in weights, and we see that it's taking place mostly among culturally conservative people and with regard to cultural conservative issues and positions. So we think there's a lot more to examine here and to explore, but exactly, I think the intuition of the question was right. We see less weight put on economic issues, and among culturally conservative people, more weight put on cultural issues. Now, with regard to Brett's questions about the potential endogeneity between party interests and the weight put on issues, this is a fair question and a good one. And our goal here is not to argue for causality, which of the three factors is driving which, but rather to see the relative contribution to this overall trend of growing support for the populist right. I would note that in our data, we have countries where populist radical right parties were an important player in the political arena already in the early 90s, for instance, in Austria. And because we can run this decomposition exercise in specific countries, in fact, that's what we do, we can also look at countries where we haven't seen this entrance and see there which of the three factors best explain changes in support for the populist right, and also disentangle entrance from changes in party positions. So the fact that we have multiple cases in which radical right parties enter at different moments in time, and in some of them radical right parties were part of the political arena already when the dataset begins, allows us to go around this issue. But this is a good question. Thanks.
I can respond about the question on Poland. So the data that we used are from 2017, and what they pointed back then was that Poland seemed far away from reaching the so-called tipping point, of struggle between more conservative and progressive views. But your point is very fair that now things have changed in the meantime. So it could be that more recent data might shed a light on a different picture. So I guess it's we'll have to see. But yeah, for sure, it's going to be interesting.
Right, thank you. So I think we have 2 more rounds of questions. Thank you everybody for your interest. And actually, there's a lot of interest. One of the questions is whether they're already working papers. So if you just want to say something very quickly, whether people can email you about possible working papers, and then we've got. Again, and I'll just go in the same order again. So for Noam first, we have 2 questions that are more specifically about the decomposition strategy, both from Matthew and from Michael. And Matthew's question is how the decomposition strategy deals with the difference between voter shifts versus the transition between voters and abstainers, how it deals with that. And Michal's question goes with how the whole how the model or the strategy works with changing, if we think that voters express their views in relation to some sort of mean or dominant view, and if that dominant view changes, or how, whether you can include that into your model. And then I had a question for Elena. So you have these individual country quantitative analysis, and when I looked at your big table with the external factors, I was thinking about QCA, and I'm wondering whether that would be a sort of a fruitful sort of second step of the analysis to kind of bring it all together and really sort of assess the significance of the individual factors. So I was just wondering whether you've thought about that, and we'll leave it at that, and then we'll have one more round of questions from Mathis and Franz Fallen's questions. Okay, Noam.
Thanks. So for Matthew's questions about difference between abstainers and voters, this is something that remains outside the scope of our analysis. So we don't really account for changes in turnout, and whether these parties, the populist radical right parties, mostly attract voters of other parties or people who previously abstained. So for that, we do not have a clear answer. We are looking at people who say they identify with a party that is classified as a populist radical right party. So this is for us the starting point, that we are looking at people who say that they vote for these parties, and then we try to understand how and why and how that relates to the 3 factors that I mentioned. Now, regarding changes in the dominant view, I'm not 100% sure that I got the logic behind it. I know that we are running the analysis at the country level. So for instance, if one country is more socially conservative than another country, that shouldn't bias our results. We are looking at this decomposition exercise in each country, and then what I presented now, just for the sake of brevity, is the averages across the different countries, but we do the decomposition exercise by country, because we understand that countries may differ in many ways, including in what is considered the dominant view or the consensus view, if something like that even exists. Now, if in a certain country the dominant view, or more broadly public opinion, changes over time, and that shapes who votes for populist radical right parties, this is something captured in our model, right? That would fit into the first category of explanation, that shifts in public opinion. Maybe something that was once considered like a fringe opinion is now considered mainstream, and maybe that's what's driving people toward populist radical right party. If it is this change in attitude that explains the support for the populist radical right, then for us it's not a problem. It's something that will be captured in our model. So I hope it addresses the question, and if I missed it, I'm happy to be in touch later on. And just to go back to Anika's comment at the beginning, we have a working paper. We are looking for people who'd be willing to read it and provide us with comments. So do feel free to shoot me an email and I'll share the paper with you. Thanks.
Yeah, We also have a paper if anyone is interested, I can share. And about the QCA, it would be probably a very interesting method to apply. Also because, yeah, as seen in the paper, the more contextual information and the quantitative data did really provide a very nice insight and shed a light on things that we weren't expecting, like, for instance, this negative relationship of social conservatism for the support for authoritarian populist parties. So I think it would be definitely a good idea for follow-up or for other studies of this type to integrate and provide the more complete overview, I guess.
Yeah, I think personally, I'm a big fan of integrating the strengths of the quantitative and the qualitative methods in research design. So I think there's a lot that can still be done there. All right, wonderful. So one last round of questions. So Mathis Roder has questions for both Noam and Elena. And one of the, I think, of his questions to Noam were already dealt with, sort of the individual level issue importance versus the country level issues importance. But he also noticed that you started out with a Venn diagram of your three kind of big explanations. And he asked whether you can say a bit more about this. So is this about the interactions between the individual level explanations and the context? How do you take that into account? And then we have actually two questions for Elena. Also from Mathis, he asked about how you measure your independent variables. Especially says I could imagine authoritarianism, anti-immigration, and nationalism to be closely related. Was that an issue in your analysis, or do you are you confident that you have clearly distinct phenomena there? And Franz Walland actually asked about your dependent variable and the measurement of your dependent variable. He says, if I understand it correctly, it seems to be the vote share of authoritarian populist parties. And he wonders whether that's enough to prove the cultural backlash. So he says that public attitudes may have shifted in that direction in general, with not only populists profiting, but also former mainstream right parties. And is that a factor in your analysis? And I'll stop at that. And I think those are all our questions. So Noam, maybe you can.
Yeah, well, thanks. First, I'll take the opportunity to thank Matthias for the Populist data set, which we used quite extensively in this paper. So I'll give one straightforward answer, and then I'll try to engage on a deeper theoretical level with the issue you raised. So one thing that I find very appealing in the decomposition method, which I should admit that I'm here building on the work of my colleagues and co-authors who are all economists, is that we pose the question, which of the three factors best explain, or how much of the rise of populist right parties is explained by each of these factors. Now, it may be that the decomposition method will tell us, well, it's like 100% this factor, or it's 100% another factor. And what I like about it is that the results could also be, well, it's 30% this and 40% that, and it varies across different parties. So in a way, for me, like the Venn diagram is that it's not just one of these factors, it's all of them, but to different degrees. And actually, for voters' attitude, they do matter, but negatively. So it's not that they are completely, that they have no part within this Venn diagram. They do it, they just function maybe in a different way than what we would expect. So in terms of the relative importance of each, the way I think about it, that we do address this Venn diagram in a way, or like it is reflected in how we approach it, because the decomposition can tell us, well, it's all of these factors together somehow, but how exactly the composition, or how exactly each of them contribute, varies both by time periods and both across countries. So maybe this is the more straightforward answer. But on a deeper theoretical level, we are struggling a little bit with how we think about the weights, because the most straightforward way, that's something that is an attribute of the voters, right? Like how much weight voters put on each specific issues. But in Bart-Bonikovsky's formulation, these weights or resonance is something that takes place between the two levels of analysis. So the interactions of what voters believe, that would be their attitudes, and what parties say, and that would be the parties' characteristics. So we ourselves, I think I alluded to that earlier, are still thinking whether we should locate the weights as something that takes place in between these levels of voters and parties, between supply and demand, and that maybe is what you are suggesting in your comment, or we should just be more straightforward and say, no, that's another attribute of the voters. I think that theoretically it's probably something that is shaped at the interactions of parties and voters, but practically, it's easier to explain just as an attribute of the voters. So we are still on the fence about it, and I'm happy to continue the conversation later on, because I'm sure you have more thoughts about this. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll try to reply. So regarding the first question on the variables, we did check for multicollinearity. But it was a little bit tricky indeed to build variables that could be reliable, and especially it was tricky to build an authoritarianism index with the EVS data, because the set of questions regarding parental styles was not reliable across countries, so we had to rely on different set of questions. So we basically measured authoritarianism by asking whether there is need for more law and order, and whether we need it is good to have a leader that doesn't bother with elections. So we measured it like that, which we are aware of the weaknesses of this variable, but it was the best option on the table, basically. And on the overall benefiting of parties with regard to the shift towards more social conservative values, we did not directly face that issue, because we focused simply on the authoritarian populist, and we made reference to the cultural backlash theory, so we did not address it. But I think with this regard, I'll talk about the country that I have more knowledge about. The Italian case would be probably interesting to test if different parties are benefiting from this, as we do have more than one right-wing populist party. So I guess that would be definitely a case to see how that is playing and how that might play in the future, like probably resetting, reconfiguring of this discourse between parties tackling into the same issues. So I think that would probably be the best case to see how that is looking.
Excellent. Many thanks for the responses to the questions and the fantastic audience, the large amount of questions. Let me close the session, and before I do so, let me remind you of two pieces of information that I believe are quite important in the seminar. So first of all, let me remind you that we will open a call for the next semester in the coming days, so stay tuned on Twitter with regards to our call. because at the end of the day, as we saw today, the excellent presentations that we have and your contributions make the seminar so great. So we are really excited to hear about your research in the next semester as well. Let me also remind you that we go into a quick Christmas break, but are back with 2 exciting sessions after Christmas. We have one on mainstreaming of populism, where Laura Jacobs and Miko Matsunaga are going to present how populist ideas may affect mainstream parties and how mainstream parties may use populism. And then in the last session in this season, we have 2 presentations on the psychology of populism by Gijs Schumacher and Rodolfo Saarfield. Again, stay tuned on Twitter, where we will provide more information in due time. So let me close the session today by thanking the presenters again for the exciting presentations and sharing your research. I think this was really exciting and interesting for us, and the extensive discussion really shows that this is really exciting. Let me also thank you, the audience, for posing these questions, for providing us with your perspectives, and thank you, Annika, for moderating. So with that, I hope you have a fantastic festive period ahead, and see you in January in the next sessions.